Sawadika. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a very special session today with Professor Dr. Amartya Sen, the 1998 Nobel Laureate for Economic Sciences. This lecture today has been organized by the Thai National Health Commission, which also played host to the National Health Assembly for the past 3 days, as many of you may know. For your information, we have simultaneous interpreting services for those of you who would like to listen in Thai. And I would also like to mention that we are honored by a very qualified interpreter, Kun Surani, who also had the privilege to have studied with Professor Sen at Harvard in economics, so I'm sure the quality of the interpretation would be quite excellent. So at this time, I think we would just start right away. I would like to ask Prof.Amartya Sen, the Secretary General of the National Health Commission, to tell us about the objectives of today's event. Please, Prof.Amartya.
เรียนท่านผู้เข้าร่วมรับฟังปาฐกถาพิเศษทุกท่านครับผมนายแพทย์อำพลจินดาวัฒนะเลขาธิการคณะกรรมการสุขภาพแห่งชาติครับรู้สึกยินดีและเป็นเกียรติอย่างยิ่งที่สช.หรือสำนักงานคณะกรรมการสุขภาพแห่งชาตินะครับซึ่งเป็นหน่วยงานของรัฐที่อยู่ในกำกับนายกรัฐมนตรีที่ตั้งขึ้นตามพระราชบัญญัติสุขภาพแห่งชาติพ.ศ. 2550นะครับที่ได้มีโอกาสเป็นเจ้าภาพจัดงานปาฐกถาพิเศษในวันนี้ครับก็ผมขอบพระคุณทุกท่านนะครับที่ให้ความสนใจที่เข้าร่วมรับฟังปาฐกถาพิเศษในเช้าวันนี้ครับท่านผู้มีเกียรติครับประเด็นเรื่องความเป็นธรรมถือได้ว่ากำลังเป็นเรื่องที่อยู่ในความสนใจของคนไทยจำนวนมากนะครับเพราะประเทศของเรากำลังก้าวเข้าสู่ช่วงของกระแสการปฏิรูปประเทศไทยนะครับซึ่งมีการนำแนวคิดต่างๆมาประยุกต์ใช้ในทางปฏิบัติซึ่งถือว่าเป็นเรื่องสำคัญอย่างมากครับในช่วงเวลาหลายปีมานี้สำนักงานคณะกรรมการสุขภาพแห่งชาติหรือสช.ได้มีส่วนร่วมทำงานสร้างเสริมกระบวนการมีส่วนร่วมของทุกภาคส่วนในการเข้ามาร่วมกันพัฒนาและขับเคลื่อนนโยบายสาธารณะตามแนวทางประชาธิปไตยแบบมีส่วนร่วมซึ่งเป็นส่วนหนึ่งของความพยายามในการลดความเหลื่อมล้ำและเพิ่มความเป็นธรรมในเชิงของสิทธิและโอกาสของคนไทยล่าสุดนี้ได้มีการจัดสมัชชาสุขภาพแห่งชาติครั้งที่3ในหัวข้อหลักร่วมฝ่าวิกฤตความเป็นธรรมนำสังคมสู่สุขภาวะเมื่อวันที่15 ถึง 17 ธันวาคมเพิ่งเสร็จไปเมื่อวานนี้ครับเพื่อให้ทุกภาคส่วนได้เข้ามามีส่วนร่วมพัฒนาข้อเสนอทางนโยบายต่างๆและร่วมกันขับเคลื่อนนโยบายสาธารณะเหล่านั้นไปสู่การปฏิบัติโดยมีเป้าหมายเพื่อสร้างสังคมไทยที่มีสุขภาวะครับซึ่งในงานดังกล่าวนั้นได้รับเกียรติจากท่านศาสตราจารย์ดร.อมาตยาเซนได้กรุณาแสดงปาฐกถาพิเศษก่อนพิธีปิดเมื่อวานนี้เป็นที่เรียบร้อยแล้วครับและในวันนี้เราก็ยังได้รับความกรุณาจากท่านได้สละเวลาก่อนเดินทางกลับนะครับท่านก็มาแสดงปาฐกถาพิเศษในวันนี้ในเวทีสาธารณะแห่งนี้ซึ่งสช.จัดขึ้นโดยมีวัตถุประสงค์หลักในวันนี้ก็คือเป็นการท้าทายความคิดและสร้างแรงบันดาลใจต่อทุกท่านในการนำทฤษฎีและหลักคิดต่างๆที่เป็นสากลมาสู่การปฏิบัติในทุกระดับที่แต่ละท่านเกี่ยวข้องแตกต่างกันออกไปครับปาฐกถาพิเศษในวันนี้เป็นส่วนหนึ่งของการเชื้อเชิญคนไทยเรารวมทั้งเพื่อนชาวต่างประเทศนะครับได้ร่วมกันเข้ามาร่วมคิดร่วมกันปฏิบัติการเพื่อขับเคลื่อนการปฏิรูปประเทศไทยไปในทิศทางที่จะนำไปสู่การลดความเหลื่อมล้ำและเพิ่มความเป็นธรรมในสังคมไทยของเราต่อไปครับในฐานะองค์กรเจ้าภาพผมขอบคุณท่านทั้งหลายอีกครั้งหนึ่งครับที่ได้มาร่วมกันในเวทีวันนี้และในอันดับถัดไปครับกับผมขอกราบเรียนเชิญนายแพทย์มงคลณสงขลา อดีตรัฐมนตรีว่าการกระทรวงสาธารณสุขครับในฐานะผู้ทรงคุณวุฒิได้กรุณากล่าวต้อนรับและแนะนำองค์ปาฐกขอกราบเรียนเชิญท่านนายแพทย์มงคลครับ
คุณหมออัมพลได้พูดภาษาลาวไปแล้วเดี๋ยวผมจะต้องพูดในสิ่งที่โปรเฟสเซอร์ท่านฟังแล้วรู้เรื่องไปด้วยนะครับต้องขออภัยครับถ้าถือว่าเราปนภาษาอื่นนะครับ Good morning distinguished guests ladies and gentlemen It is a great honor that the National Health Commission allow me to the task of welcoming and introducing the Nobel laureate Professor Amartya Sen, our speaker today. Professor Amartya Sen was born in India, the cradle of ancient civilization and the root of Thai civilization. He grew up in Santiniketan, which is a small town near Bhopal in the Bohum district of West Bengal, 180 kilometers north of Kolkata, Kolkata that we already know. Santiniketan means abode of peace. Was made famous by the first Asian Nobel laureate, Rabindranath Tagore. We know him as Rabindranath Tagore, who received the Nobel Prize in 1913. After he got the Nobel Prize, Rabindranath upgraded his ideal school named Pata Pavana to the university named Visva Bharati University. Later it became the famous Central University of India, and the small town Santiniketan became the university town. Professor Amartya Sen grown up in the compound of this university, and his family is a scholar. What I know, his father is a chemist. Not surprised that he became one of the illustrious students of this university. Many famous people like Kanti, including our very own humble Kaluna Kalayasai, the Indian study scholar, attended university. After study in India, Professor Amartya Sen proceeded his study at top university in the West, such as Cambridge, Oxford, Harvard, MIT, Stanford, University of California, in Berkeley and Cornell. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Sen grown up from the East of scholar family. Studied from both East and West, he mingles in an international circle of friends and associates who come from various schools of thought. This sensitivity for cultural diversity is clearly reflected in Professor Sen's work. You might therefore no wonder how he became known as the economist for the poor. When he seemed to have lived most of his life in such a distinguished setting, Professor Amartya Sen is the exceptional polymath brilliance of the present time. He won the Nobel Prize Award in Economics in 1998 He used a part of his prize money to establish the Patrici Foundation, which is devoted the development of education, public health, and gender equality in India and Bangladesh. His many books include Development as Freedom, Nationalities and Freedom, and Argumentative India, Identities and Violence. And Professor Sen's most recent book, The Idea of Justice from Idea to Action. He wrote that the sensitivity for injustice is an exceptional quality of human beings. Without this sensitivity, important change on a global scale cannot take place. According to Professor Sen, injustice cannot be eradicated, but can be alleviated. It is possible to promote justice along the lines of Thailand's reform approach that shared by the former Prime Minister Anand and the mandate of National Health Commission. Ladies and gentlemen, we cannot deny that Thai society today is plagued with inequality and injustice. A great number of people in my generation, as well as the younger generation, have taken steps to tackle this problem. This current crisis is also an opportunity to create change. We need new knowledge, perspective, and kindness. Today marks an excellent opportunity to come together and learn from the wisdom of Professor Sen, world-renowned welfare economist. Not only is he well equipped with knowledge in economics, politics, and society, but he is also widely recognized as one of the leading philosophers and thinkers of our time. Ladies and gentlemen, let's all extend a warm welcome to Professor Sen, world-renowned thinker who is certainly the pride of Asia.
It is a great privilege and great honor for me to be here, and I thank you for all for coming and for the commission for the kindness in inviting me, and I thank Dr. Mongkol for very kind words in introducing me. Thank you very much indeed. I'm very keen on Q&A, so I'm hoping that there will be time for that. When I thought there was 10 minutes for Q&A and 1 hour for the paper, I tried to change that to make the paper 40 minutes, so we should have a half an hour Q&A. And hopefully we will get round to chatting with each other. The title of my book is The Idea of Justice, but the title of this talk is From Idea to Action. That wasn't chosen by me, but it seemed all right when it was suggested to me, and therefore we went along with it. So I read you first the talk, which should take about 40 minutes, I think. When young Gautama, later known as Buddha, left his princely home in the foothills of the Himalayas in search of enlightenment 2,500 years ago, he was moved by the sight of mortality, morbidity, and disability. He was also distressed by the ignorance he saw around him. When, as a young schoolboy, at Santiniketan, which Mr. Long will explain, I first read about this much recollected history, I remember being immensely moved and also, in many ways, energized. Indeed, Buddha's concern and his knowledge-centered approach to confronting difficult problems have been among the major sources of inspiration throughout my life. I should explain, to make it absolutely clear, that I am not religious, and therefore I am not a Buddhist or a follower of any other religion. But it is possible to benefit greatly from understanding the sources of Gautam Buddha's agony, and I will later discuss his enlightenment. But the agony first, particularly the deprivations and the insecurities of human life. Even if we have no great inclination to try to follow Buddha's lead in exploring, going beyond that, exploring the ultimate nature of the universe. I am concerned rather with them in following Buddha's idea at a more worldly level. Indeed, as I've tried to argue in an earlier paper called Buddha and the Modern World, it was first read at a conference in Singapore, arranged in the new Nalanda Srivijaya Center, and later published there. As I argued there, it's easier to draw on Buddha's ideas than that of many, almost any other religious leader, because the story of his life makes him look as if he is very close to us. The ideas that moved him, including the fear of mortality, the tragedy of old age and disability, the terrible impact of diseases on human life, move us too, no matter what religious belief, if any, we may have or intend to pursue. And we too see the dangers of ignorance and of badly organized societies, to which Buddha would give much thought as his own enlightenment proceeded. But no matter at which level we confront these adversities, the focus on knowledge and understanding and on reasoning and enlightenment remains as important in our vastly different world today as it was in Buddha's own time 2.5 millennia ago. What has all this got to do with justice and injustice in the world today? I would argue a great deal. As we consider the challenges of dealing with the colossal problems of human insecurity and social injustice in the contemporary world, the importance of seeking an enlightened approach, informed by reasoning with oneself and with others, remains deeply relevant. Before I move on to discuss the idea of justice, which is the chosen topic for discussion today, let me point briefly to three features of what we can see in secular terms as a critical approach derived directly from Buddha's reasoning, which should be particularly relevant to the engagement with the idea of justice. It is, I should explain, not my claim that these are the most important features of Buddha's thinking. Indeed, my claim is nothing at all as grand as that. But that these features present in Buddha's approach still remain important in thinking, even in completely secular terms today, of right and wrong, and of justice and injustice. The first of the features I want to discuss relates to Buddha's concern with life and living, and not just with institutions, arrangements, and other what we might call organizational features. I shall call this a life-centered approach. It may appear very odd, superficially, that I am attributing a life-centered understanding of the engagement of reasoning to someone, Buddha, whose priorities are often thought of as being life-denying. He did emphasize the attainment of nirvana, didn't he? But we have to remember that Buddha was motivated to undertake his long search precisely by the agonies and infirmities of human life. And in different ways, he was still dealing with human deprivations, even when he explored the nature of good life and the goodness of the world. In fact, broader than human deprivations of all living creatures. He remained concerned about mortality, about mobility, about disability, about ignorance, and about lack of understanding. This is in sharp contrast with many approaches to justice that can be described in terms of what ultimately counts, what can be described as life-denying. Consider, for example, the approach to the idea of right and the just as articulated by Ferdinand I, the Holy Roman Emperor in the 16th century. Ferdinand I famously claimed, fiat justitia et feriat mundus, which can be translated from Latin as, let justice be done, though the world perish, unquote. The Holy Roman Emperor's indifference to suffering of living creatures as the world perishes, focusing instead on some abstract idea of rightness, could not have been endorsed by Buddha's reasoning. I note here in passing, since this meeting is concerned with national health, that the life-centered approach to understanding the claims of justice gives us an immediate entry into problems of ill health and the need for social engagement to confront this. I shall come back to this connection later on in this talk. A second striking feature of the approach that emerges from Buddha's line of thinking is its inclusiveness. And I shall call this feature of Buddha's thought as an inclusive approach. There are no exclusions in this approach. If the first feature has a special relevance to Thailand, given its deep commitment to enhancing people's health through informed and reasoned public policy, the second feature relates to issues of divisiveness within the society that has plagued Thailand a great deal in recent years. I'm aware that some commentators would find it puzzling that I'm including Thai Buddhism as a part of a universalist tradition, since it's often presumed, since Buddhism in Thailand is mainly of the Theravada kind, as opposed to the broader Mahayana tradition, which is supposed to include everyone, there cannot be universalism in Thai Buddhism. This, I believe, is a mistake, since universalism in the social sense that I'm invoking here is a basic feature of Buddhism in general, which includes the Theravada. The difference between Theravada and Mahayana, and this is not a occasion to discuss that, lie in the more theological territory of salvation, with which I'm not particularly concerned in this talk. Thailand's record of inclusiveness in its health coverage is excellent. Indeed, I would say exceptional. There is an inclusiveness here that even the United States, with its private insurance system, does not yet have. And yet the possibility of inclusive dialogue that unites rather than divides people has been deeply elusive in this otherwise wonderful nation. And this remains a problem in contemporary political scenarios. This is an issue of political importance in Thailand today, but let me address the more general principle of universal inclusiveness first in the tradition of Buddhist understanding of social interaction. I should mention here how pioneering the approach of those inspired by Buddha was very early in the intellectual history of the world. Indeed, some of the earliest open general meetings in the world aimed specifically at settling disputes between people, between different points of view, took place in India in the so-called Buddhist councils, where adherents of different points of view got together to argue out their differences, beginning in the 6th century BC. The first of these councils met in Rajagriha, then the capital of what is now called Bihar, Magadha, and Rajagriha is now called Rajgir, and this was shortly after Gautam Buddha's death. And the second was held about 100 years later in Vaishali, and they went on happening regularly. The last one happened in the 2nd century AD in Kashmir. Emperor Ashoka, who hosted the largest, it was the third, Buddhist council in the 3rd century BC in Patna, then called Pataliputra, which was the capital city of his empire over India. Indeed, he was the first Indian emperor for the whole nation, following the footsteps of his grandfather Chandragupta. In that Buddhist council, Ashoka also tried to codify and propagate what were among the earliest formulations of rules for public discussion, some kind of an early version of the 19th century famous American Robert's Rules of Order. To choose another historical example, in early 7th century Japan, the Buddhist prince Shotoku, who was regent to his mother, Emperor Sukui, produced the so-called Constitution of 17 Articles in 604 AD. That constitution insisted, much in the spirit of Magna Carta, to be signed 6 centuries later in 1215 AD. I quote from the Constitution of 17 Articles. Quote, decisions on important matters should not be made by one person alone. They should be discussed with many, unquote. Some commentators, like Hajime Nakamura, have seen in this 7th century Buddhism-inspired constitution Japan's first step of gradual development towards democracy. The Constitution of 17 Articles went on to explain, I quote again, "Nor let us be resentful when others differ from us. For all men have hearts, and each heart has its own leanings. Their right can be our wrong, and our right their wrong," unquote. A third feature that's worth identifying is the focus on universal responsibility in this line of thinking, which goes much beyond the narrowly conditional and contingent cooperation that the popular approach of social contract theory has made central to contemporary theories of justice in the West. I shall call this aspect of Buddha's approach the responsibility of power, something I've discussed in some detail in my book, The Idea of Justice. The perspective of non-contractual obligation of people's power and capability is presented powerfully by Gautama Buddha in many documents, but most clearly, I think, in Sutta Nipata. Buddha argues that we have responsibility to animals precisely because of the asymmetry between us, not because of any symmetry that takes us to the need for cooperation, in this case with animals. He argues instead that since we are enormously more powerful, of which there cannot be any doubt, than the other species, that power itself gives us some responsibility towards other species that connects exactly with this asymmetry of power. But they goes on to illustrate the point by an analogy with the responsibility of the mother towards her child. Not because she has given birth to the child, that connection is not invoked in this particular argument in Sutta Nipata. There is room for it elsewhere. But because she can do things to influence the child's life that the child itself cannot do. The mother's reason for helping the child in this line of thinking is not guided by the rewards of cooperation, but precisely from a recognition that she can asymmetrically do things for the child that will make a huge difference to child life and which the child itself cannot do. The mother does not have to seek any mutual benefit, real or imagined, nor seek any as-if contract to understand her obligation to the child. This is a point that Gautama, I think, is making. And it is strikingly different from the Hobbesian, contractual line of thinking on obligation towards each other that has come to dominate, totally dominate, contemporary theories of justice. The justification here takes the form of arguing that if some action that can be freely undertaken is open to a person, thereby making it feasible, and if the person assesses that the undertaking of that action will create a more just situation in the world, thereby making it justice enhancing, then that is argument enough for the person to consider seriously what he or she should do in view of these recognitions. There can, of course, be many actions that individually satisfy these dual conditions. We may not, however, be able to undertake all those actions, that we understand. The reasoning here is therefore not a demand for immediate and unconditional action whenever the two conditions I described are met, but an argument for acknowledging the obligation in an enlightened way to consider the case for action. The mother's sense of obligation to the infant child not only satisfies the dual condition, but it comes to enjoy a priority over other things that the mother may have reason to do if she was free to undertake them. While it's possible to bring in some social contract-based reasoning in some hugely extended and, I believe, rather artificial form, given the ingenuity of that approach, to work out the case for the mother to consider helping her child, some kind of an infinite social contract, mother helps this child, the child, when it becomes mother helps the next child, and so on. But that, I think, is really not a very natural way of thinking about it. It would be a much more roundabout way of getting to a conclusion that reasoning from the obligation of power can directly yield. The basic point to recognize here is the existence of different approaches to the pursuit of reasonable behavior, not all of which need be parasitic on the advantage-based reasoning of mutually beneficial cooperation. Indeed, cooperative advantage is only one of many reasons for doing things for others in this broader perspective, and the totality of reasons takes us well beyond the limited approach of the social contract theory. That, in fact, is the point of departure, contrast with social contract theory, in my book, The Idea of Justice. In that, I have argued for recognizing the need for a fundamental departure in the understanding of the concept of justice. A departure not merely from the mainstream theories of justice in contemporary political philosophy, but also from the long tradition in Europe, going over several centuries, of situating the analysis of justice in the framework of a so-called social contract. The social contract approach was pioneered by Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century, and it has been the strongest influence in the analysis of justice from the 18th century to our own time. The departure I have proposed demands some fairly radical change of focus in the mainstream theories of justice that are dominant at the present time. it also demands, I would argue, some variation in the way we think about our contemporary challenges of public policy, global as well as national. Is there a connection with Buddha's approach? Is there a connection to my theory? Indeed there is, as I've discussed in the book, I think in some detail. But it's not the only intellectual ancestry, I should make clear, of the understanding of the idea of justice that I'm trying to advance. Buddha's is one source. There are other traditions too, from across the world, on which I draw. But the three particular features of the approach derived from Buddha's thoughts, which I've been outlining here and talked about, do fit squarely with the idea of justice I've been trying to explore. This line of reasoning is based on the idea of the social contract. This line of reasoning based on the idea of, The line of reasoning based on the idea of social contract, the alternative, concentrates on identifying perfectly just social arrangement which the social contract seeks, taking the characterization of just institutions, so it's an institutional approach, to be the principal and often the only identified task of the theory of justice. This way of seeing justice is woven in different ways around the idea of an imagined social contract, a hypothetical contract that the population of a sovereign state are supposed to be a party to. Major contributions were made in this line of thinking by Thomas Hobbes that I mentioned, John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and of course Immanuel Kant, among others. The contractarian approach has become the dominant influence in contemporary philosophy, led by the most prominent political, and I believe the best political philosopher of our time, John Rawls, whose classic book, A Theory of Justice, published in 1971, presents a definitive statement of the social contract approach to justice. I should explain that I differ sharply from it, but I'm also very respectful of Rawls. Indeed, learned a lot of political philosophy from him, and I even taught courses together with him. And my book is dedicated to him, though he knew, he died by the time the book came out, he was always encouraging me to write the book. But he knew, of course, that I would differ from it. He didn't know that I would dedicate the book to him, because I really learned so much from him in the dialectical way. The principal theories of justice in contemporary political philosophy, coming not only from Rawls, but also from Robert Nozick, Ronald Dworkin, David Gautier, and others, though different from each other in specific content, draw in general on the social contract approach and concentrate on the search for ideal social institutions. In contrast, a number of other Enlightenment theorists, beginning with Adam Smith, the Marquis de Condorcet, one of the theorists of the French Revolution, and Mary Wollstonecraft, the pioneering feminist, and I believe the most underestimated philosopher of all time, and extending later in the 19th century to Karl Marx and John Stuart Mill, among others, they all took a variety of approaches that differed in many respects from each other. I think Marx could not have tolerated any comparison with Mill because he thought very little of him. Mill didn't think very little of Marx because I think he never heard of him. But even though they differed from each other, they shared a common interest in making comparisons between different ways in which people's lives may go, jointly influenced by the working of institutions. That's very important in social contract theory, but going beyond institutions, people's actual behavior, very Buddhist concern, their social interactions, and other factors that significantly impact on what actually happens. Instead of relying on some hypothetical contract to which everyone involved is taken to be, or imagined to be, since it's not real, a party, the alternative approach can concentrate on what agreement can emerge today on the basis of public reasoning, how justice can be enhanced. The idea of justice I've been exploring draws on the dialogic method that was a very prominent part of the priorities also of European Enlightenment, just as it does on Buddha's reason-based exploration of ethical obligation 2,000 years before that individuals and societies have to recognize. The analytical, and quite frankly rather mathematical, discipline of social choice theory, which had its origin in the works of French mathematicians in the 18th century, in particular the Marquis de Condorcet, but also others like Jean-Charles de Baudin, which had been revived and reformulated in our own time by Kenneth Arrow, belongs robustly to this alternative line of investigation different from social contract theory. I must confess that I have been very involved myself in the development and use of social choice theory. In fact, my novel to which you kindly referred, it was in welfare economics, but most of the papers cited are in fact mathematical papers, social choice theory. I feel sometimes like an imposter when I read in the paper saying, now at last the novel is recognizing non-mathematical work, given the fact that pretty much all the papers they cite are quite mathematical. The first one that they cite is called necessary and sufficient condition for binary consistency of majority decision. Doesn't sound particularly non-mathematical. But it's concerned, it's moved, of course, by the same approach which I'm trying to present here, and mathematics has just happened to be a way of making the point. I focus particularly on the exploration of the constructive possibilities of the social choice approach, different in that respect from Kenneth Arrow's focus on generating impossibility results. And I've been involved over some decades in the derivation and elucidation of the demands of justice with the help of mathematical social choice theory, supplemented by general and largely non-mathematical political and moral reasoning. There are three principal departures in the theory of justice I've tried to present in contrast with the social contract approach. First, rather than beginning with asking, what is perfect justice? A question in the answer to which I believe there could be very substantial and unreconcilable differences even among very reasonable people. And my point is we don't have to resolve it to decide what would be a justice-enhancing thing to do today. We don't have to share the ultimate vision of the universe. Instead of that, I argue for following Condorcet and Adam Smith in asking about the identification of clear cases of injustice on which agreement could emerge on the basis of reasoning. In arguing, for example, for the abolition of slavery in the 18th century world, as the Marquis de Condorcet, Adam Smith, and Mary Wollstonecraft did, they did not have to seek an agreement on the nature of the perfectly just society. In fact, debates on the utopia of the perfectly just world can have very distracting and diverting effects on the pursuit of justice here and now in the reduction of injustice in the world, on which agreement could emerge, despite our differences of the view of perfect justice. Second, our focus need not be only on institutions. In contrast with the social contract approach, which is interested primarily in the identification of just institutions, we can examine instead the nature of lives that people are actually able to lead. In this way of understanding the problem, the idea of justice has to be realization-based, people-centered, what I earlier called life-centered approach, rather than institution-centered. Third, unlike the social contract approach, which by construction must be confined to the people of a particular sovereign state, the alternative approach can involve people from anywhere in the world, since the focus here is on reasoned agreement rather than on state-based social contract. Even as great a political philosopher of our time, one of the greatest, Tom Nagel, in an article called Global Justice, argues that the global justice, idea of global justice, is an illusion, is a chimera. Why? Because there's no global state. And since no global state, you can't have a global sovereign state, they can't have an agreement between all people. Ergo, there is no global justice. But if you take the alternative approach, can we reasonably agree what would enhance justice, then of course it's a very different approach that we follow. This departure makes reasoning on global justice possible, which is essential for addressing such problems as today's global economic crisis, or global warming, or prevention and management of global pandemics, such as the AIDS epidemic. These are not just matters of humanitarian concern, as Nagel argues. These are matters of global justice. In contrast with the old social contract approach to justice, which has so far dominated professional philosophical investigation of justice, we get in this alternative approach a focus on people's lives rather than on institutions, and a concentration on reasoned agreement about how to advance justice rather than searching for some imagined contract to establish a set of perfectly just institutions. In a suitably broad formulation, this can be the basis of global reasoning rather than nationally separated pursuit of justice in sequestered ways. In understanding the contrast between an arrangement focus and a realization focus of justice, it's useful to invoke an old distinction from the Sanskrit literature on ethics and jurisprudence. Consider two different words, niti and nyaya, both of which stand for justice in classical Sanskrit. Among the principal users of the term niti are organizational propriety and behavioral correctness. In contrast with niti, the term nyaya stands for a comprehensive concept of realized justice. In that line of vision, the roles of institutions, of rules, of organization, important as they are, have to be assessed ultimately in the broader and more inclusive perspective of nyaya, which is inescapably linked with the world that actually emerges, not just institutions or rules we happen to have. To consider a particular application, early Indian legal theorists talked disparagingly of what they call matsanyaya, justice in the world of fish, where a big fish can freely devour a small fish. So that is a kind of view that justice of fish, which is, we are warned again. We are warned that avoiding matsanyaya must be an essential part of justice, and it's crucial to make sure that this kind of justice of fish, the big following the small, is not allowed to invade the world of human beings. The central recognition here is the realization of justice in the sense of nyaya is not just a matter of judging institutions and rules, but of judging the societies themselves. No matter how proper the established organization might be, if a big fish could still devour a small fish at will, then that must be a patent violation of human justice as nyaya. A realization-focused perspective also makes it easier to understand the importance of the prevention of manifest injustice in the world rather than seeking the perfectly just. As the example of matsanyaya makes clear, the subject of justice is not merely about trying to achieve or dreaming about achieving some perfectly just society or social arrangement, but about preventing manifestly severe injustice, just as avoiding the dreadful state of matsanyaya. This is a recurrent thought about matsanyaya. The last reference I know, I think it's 8th or 9th century, when Dharmapala, the last Buddhist kingdom in India, establishes his rule over eastern India. makes a statement, now ends Matsanaya. This is the beginning of justice, not of the face. That's his motto at that time. For example, when people agitated for the abolition of slavery in the 18th and 19th centuries, they were not laboring under the illusion that the abolition of slavery would make the world perfectly just. Not at all. It was their claim, rather, that a society with slavery was totally unjust. It was the diagnosis of an intolerable injustice in slavery that made abolition an overwhelming priority, and this did not require the search for a consensus on what a perfectly just society would look like. Those who think reasonably enough that the American Civil War, which led to the abolition of slavery, was a big strike for justice in America, would have to be reconciled to the fact that not much, indeed not anything, can be said in the perspective of the old social contract theory about the enhancement of justice through the abolition of slavery, since the Civil War did not make America perfectly just. We need a comparative approach that can identify the benefits from the removal of a particular injustice, even though the world after that removal would still not be, in any obvious sense, perfectly just. What are the consequences of changing the focus of attention from searching for just institutions to seeking the removal of injustice in the lives that people are actually able to lead? The question that immediately arises is how to understand the richness and poverty of human lives. The approach I've tried to pursue had largely focused on the freedoms that people actually enjoy. And this is one way of understanding the life-centered approach, which remains broadly in the tradition of Buddha's own line of thinking. This differs sharply from many other approaches to assessing the demands of justice, for example, looking for the fulfillment of certain formal rights that people have, whether or not these rights can be actually exercised, as institutional libertarians tend to argue for. Many of these rights can have an instrumental role, of course, in sustaining acceptable social lives. You mustn't look down on formal rights. But the pursuit of justice cannot stop there. It also demands positive help from the state and from the society and for everybody else who can help with the responsibility of power in general to make substantive individual freedom a central social commitment. An approach based on substantive freedom must insist that we scrutinize and assess different features of human lives and their combinations, that a person has the opportunity to consider and choose from. This takes us, naturally enough, beyond the domain of formal rights that the institutional perspective of libertarian philosophy tends to highlight, which can be, to a great extent, described as freedom as permission rather than freedom as facilitation. When it comes to healthcare, for example, the libertarian concern with whether we are prevented by others from getting healthcare can be important in some very special circumstances. But the bigger issue is not that. It's the need for social support, indeed state support, for what healthcare people can afford and actually have. If the freedom-based, life-centered approach has to take us well beyond the limited reach of freedom as permission, it must also take us beyond the rights, including those for help from the state, that people in principle may possess without being able to exercise these rights easily. So one of the implications of this approach is to focus on what people can actually do, including what health care people can actually get, irrespective of location, rural as well as urban, irrespective of class, poorer people as well as the more affluent, irrespective of gender, women as well as men, and so on. It is just not good enough to concentrate on the right for state, or right for state health that the rules may identify. We have to look at who is getting what kind of health care compared with what people respectively need and what the state and society can afford to provide them. So we have to look at the Naya and not just the niti of health care. This takes us naturally to the demands of inclusiveness. The Thai system of healthcare certainly has a strong inclination in that direction. I don't know enough about the details of the Thai healthcare to be able to pronounce any view on whether the system of state and social support for healthcare does have in effect the extent of inclusiveness that would be needed for a society without the injustice of avoidable exclusion. It is surely an issue to which particular attention has to be paid, and I don't doubt that the National Health Commission does do just that. A third concern is the agency of health delivery and the responsibility that goes with specific roles. A country with much difference between the rich and the poor, as we see in most countries in the world, including of course in my own country, or in this country, Thailand, has to ask questions on this constantly. Are the affluent doing enough, given their power and ability, compared with what would be needed to remove the identifiable injustices that characterize most healthcare systems? I'm posing the question rather than giving any answer, mainly because I do not know what the answer would be. But I would certainly like to know more about what the answer is and how any deficiency in this respect can be addressed and remedied. I've raised a few questions here, but a close study of the idea of justice I'm trying to present have many other implications and many other invitations to ask more questions which I do not have time to pursue. Given the time, I have to leave it there, but I hope this will be a continuous dialogue to which we should be able to come back in the future. The basic commitment, as I see it, is to use social dialogue to pursue the demands of justice, to come back to where the paper began, in a life-centered, inclusive, and widely responsible perspective. So I end by saying it has been a great privilege for me to be able to speak at the public forum arranged very kindly by the National Health Commission. I end with emphasizing the centrality of public discussions of this kind. I was very impressed yesterday to attend the Thai National Health Assembly. In one of the central points I've tried to present in my book, The Idea of Justice, is the absolute necessity of public reasoning in advancing the cause of justice. Even the idea of objectivity in political philosophy, that's a broader point, but I'll just make a quick reference to here. The idea of objectivity in political philosophy as opposed to in science relates to the ability, I've argued, of a proposed idea or a proposed strategy of action to survive in public debate, since public confrontation cannot but be an essential part of overcoming the subjectivity that people tend to be influenced by, connected with class, gender, location, and other divisions of the society. So it has been an enormous honor and opportunity for me to have been able to speak at this forum this morning. I'm most grateful, and I end with expressing my deep appreciation. Thank you. I think for my Q&A, I'm going to make a trek and climb up there.
Oh, I think.
And I can sit and take your Q&A in a more peaceful way.
So while we wait for Dr. Sen to take a seat, please think about your questions. You can ask in Thai or in English, and then our interpreter will take care of them. But I think first of all, if the former Prime Minister, Kun Anand, doesn't mind, would you like to begin with the first question or comment from the audience? Are you ready?
Thank you very much. The purpose of my presence here today is to listen, and I do not want to use any time at your expense, because I'm sure that many of you would have very interesting questions, and we all await some wise with some wise reactions and responses from Professor Sen. All I ask at this moment is that, as you know, I'm a person involved in the Reform Commission, and that quite a few crooks in this country. There are so many committees set up directly or indirectly by the government. I happen to belong to the civil society sector, and we are doing our best not to find answers to every question. I think that what we are trying to do mainly is to ensure that the inclusiveness that you refer to is a matter of importance to us. Secondly, when you talk about reform, like many other countries, Thailand needs reform or change in every aspect of our society. So it's very, very difficult to find the starting point. We all know what that the road is long and difficult. But I think that you can discuss the matter in sort of intellectual way or in a conceptual way. But I find personally that the most difficult task about any reform program or any change program in any society it could be attributed to the country's culture. And I think it's very important that our way of thinking is often the product of historical factors and cultural elements and social values. Before you can start any reform program, you must make sure that this is a view of the majority, or it is a consensus, because I don't think it would be productive to try to confront any sector of the society or any set of values. The most difficult part is how do you change the value system? That's my first question. And secondly, the values are of course based on many other elements, but the most difficult is the patronage system in Thailand. So I just leave these two questions for you. Thank you very much.
Well, I would like to say three quick things in response to Anand's very interesting questions. First, that I think that this is really quite central, the idea of culture and the value changes and the system of patronage, the system of hierarchy, which is the characteristic feature of almost every country in the world. Thailand has it in its own form, and I've got obviously no insight to offer on that, excepting to see that I've always tended to believe, and that I think is also ultimately traceable to my school schoolboy fascination with Buddha, that to identify a question is halfway of answering it. So you've identified the question, and in that sense, I think the real danger is when you don't identify. If I may put on my an economist hat, my problem at the moment with European economic policies, including that of Britain in particular, when suddenly they're cutting absolutely everything, in a kind of attempt of suddenly eliminating deficit with a level of urgency which any kind of economic analysis indicates it doesn't need, including cutting universities and so on. And there I don't think even the problem has been rightly identified. But in contrast, what you're saying, Anand, gives me heart, because it indicates that the problem is identified, even though it's a very difficult problem. So that's my first comment. The second comment is the fact that inclusiveness you see as a central issue. and the reform is needed connected with that. I think that itself is very much the kind of line that I would like to pursue, so I'm also pleased about that. My third point is a personal one. I've always been very proud of having known Anand since our college days. We were at Trinity together many years ago. I have to say it was always a wonder to see that Anand didn't seem to do any work at all and still seemed to do extremely well. So there is some kind of magic there. But I have been very privileged to remain in touch with him from my early days as a young man, and when he was a young man too. And it's really wonderful that you could come. I know that you have gone through an operation which I've also gone through, which you all tend to do these days at our age. But you're looking fantastic, and I'm delighted. Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much. Now we know Gunanand's secret when he was a student. So now, please, if you are ready, please come to the microphone and ask a question. Actually, raise your hand first will be very helpful, please.
My name is Dr. Adam Rosenblatt, and I'm a child psychiatrist from Australia, and also a blog journalist, a little bit revolutionary. But the question I have in mind, I keep in mind Jared Diamond's Collapse of Civilization, the White Tiger of India, and also what is happening throughout the world today in crisis. I'm asking the question in terms of culture. The Indian culture today seems to be moving in the direction of Christian, Hindu, American ways in combination. Are they in decay or ascendancy? And I'm comparing it to China, which is a Buddhist Maoist hybrid. Just a simple question, but very broad. Which is in the ascendancy? Is it India or is it China?
I differ from many perspectives, but I agreed with Mr. Wen, the Prime Minister, visiting India last week, saying that may be the wrong question, which is in ascendancy. Because they're not in competition, and I don't think they are. I agree with him very much. I'm not, you and I have to chat about that sometime, but I don't know that the summary is right, that China is a Buddhist, Maoist. First of all, Confucianism is, I think, the biggest influence on them. If you go by statues and so on, obviously Buddhism dominates because it's a very statue-building culture and very concerned with that kind of art form. And along with Hinduism, that you see also, whether you're looking at China, you're looking at, Vietnam, Cambodia, Indonesia, and so on. But I think the Confucian influence is very strong. There are issues of value there. People like Lee Kuan Yew try to emphasize that there's a kind of focus on duty as opposed to freedom. I have disputed that, and we have argued on that. These are not easy questions to answer, but I think one of the things I fear is the summary statement we can make. I mean, if you say India is moving towards what did you say, Hindu, Christian, and American thing, that's quite a lot to combine, actually. I don't know that in some ways really work, but there are differences, obviously. In India, we're very concerned that things get done in China in a way that things don't happen in India. But we're also very proud of the fact that if things were to happen and some people object, that gets a huge hearing and there's voice across the country. If there's anything or great thing that is being achieved in India, it's the giving people voice, and that's a big change. That's a cultural point too, to which Anand referred and which is related to your question, because that wasn't often true. It's always the case, as I argue in my book, Argumentating Indian, that some people from the lower strata, from the low caste, as well as women as opposed to men, some people very powerfully had voice, but by and large women didn't. and by and large a political voice, and by and large the lower caste. That changed. Lower castes are now the dominant influence, thank you, in Indian politics. So I think there's a complex picture. I'm not interested who will be in ascendancy, because I agree with Prime Minister Wen, that's not a battle really. But there's something, I mean, India has learned a lot from China. I don't think India would have carried out its reform but for Chinese going in. As long as it was Hong Kong, Singapore, even South Korea, Indians tend to dismiss it as being small. But when the Chinese suddenly thought that it can be played a globalization game to its advantage, suddenly the Indians were willing to sit up and listen. I think they influence each other. There are very minor ways Indians also have an influence. In the past, of course, greatly. In the past, and indeed in setting up the Nalanda University, the old Buddhist university from 5th century, which was destroyed in the 12th, which was the oldest university in the world, and to which the largest group of foreigners, which included Thais, Koreans, Japanese, but the largest group were Chinese. In fact, the only center outside China where the Chinese intellectuals were ever educated in ancient China was in Nalanda. And I'm chairing the governing body of setting it up. Dr. Prapod here, Chulalongkorn, is one of the members of this commission. There have been influences from each other. That interests me a lot. Maybe what can we learn from each other? So if you and I were to chat, I will try to argue with you that you ought to get off the switching in ascendancy question, but what we can learn from each other question.
Thank you. I think
that doesn't mean that I'm not grateful for your question.
I think I also have a question. Yes, right behind.
My name is Mahesh Patel. I work for UNICEF. Hi there. Over here.
Okay,
okay. Amartya, is the ongoing creation of a comprehensive set of human rights standards and a whole mechanism of conventions and things like that to support that, including perhaps even the international courts of justice that are a little bit prominent in the press, including, of course, the rights of children, which are very concerned with as UNICEF, is that dialogic and incremental in its conception and in its utility, or is it an idealist description of idealist state that is somehow, absolutist in that sense? And perhaps social contract based with the mechanisms of conventions and everything.
Yeah. It's a very good question, but I think it is actually dialogic and it is incremental. The human rights dialogue has always been that. One of the reasons I think that Mary Wollstonecraft is the most neglected philosopher of all time is because in her two books, The Vindication of the Rights of Men, 1790, and The Vindication of the Rights of Woman, 1792, she outlined how to think about what we now call human rights of men and women generally. And it's always a focus that you have to see what changes you can make. And it's not just legal. A lot of the changes come from education, from understanding, from enlightenment, from talking with each other, engaging. And it's not a question of trying to look for a perfect world. It's a question of what changes you can bring about now. She was concerned naturally with the subjugation of women, the abolition of slavery. She wrote to Edmund Burke saying, very peculiarly for me when I first read it, I didn't understand what she meant, because she was a revolutionary, Mary Wollstonecraft. But she wrote to Burke saying, I can't understand on what principle you can support the American Declaration of Independence. What was the problem there, I wonder? But I think what was is that because the Declaration of Independence did not deal with slavery, and therefore it was the right of some people but not others. And the judgment he was making that is not utopia. You can give the slaves the right and freedom straight away. And while they were waging the war of independence, they could engage in that issue then and there. which was the position of Adam Smith also, not often recognized, talked to such a conservative philosopher, who was absolutely dead keen on the abolition of slavery, and so on, market economy. And I think they were always argued, will this be a change? Would this be feasible in the human rights dialogue? All the time making open, keeping open, further questions to be raised as the world changes. So I think it's incremental, it's dialogic, it's interactive in all these features. I do discuss that, by the way, in my idea of justice in the penultimate chapter, is the 18th chapter book, and chapter 17 is on that subject. So if I may refer to that, and you and I are going to chat on that. Over to you.
Right. I think there's quite a few hands going up, so maybe this is how we will manage the questions, because I actually saw this hand first. But for those of you who have already raised your hands, what about coming up to the microphones and then in fact making a line, and then I will try to make this, a most justifiable process as possible. So you have had your hands up and you really want to ask your question, please come and form some sort of a line behind the microphone. So it will really help. Thank you. So maybe this question from this side. So don't be shy, please. Come and line up.
Swadikap, Ni Hao, and Namaskar. I'm a postdoctoral researcher. My name is Salil Sen.
I didn't get the name.
Shalil Sen.
Shalil Sen, okay, yeah.
The word which is resonating is the action.
You have to get closer to the microphone.
The word that is resonating is the action word. You mentioned that the big is following the small. I have an analogy for you to comment on. We have these alphabets all over the world.
Alphabet.
And the alphabet.
Yeah.
And the consonants are always more than the vowels. I believe the vowels are the action words. But right now in the global situation, the consonants are not behaving very well. We can see the currency wars, the currency conflicts, the coercion, the cataclysms due to global warming, the colossal pandemics which you mentioned. If these vowels like articulation, empathy, inclusiveness, ownership, and ubiquitous, these vowels can become more in the lexicon of the leaders, then we will have the grassroots people getting into action.
Well, I think there's 2 points. There's the linguistic point about vowels and consonants. And I may invoke a great grammarian of 4th century BC, namely Panini, saying it's an illusion to think that vowels can be pronounced alone. Even when you just say O, A, E, U, there is a consonant there, which is the absent consonant. It's not like Ka, Ku, Ki, but it's O, A. There is a consonant there, but it's a suppressed consonant. So I don't think you can really get onto a debate between vowels and consonants. Right? You have to combine them to make any kind of sense. But that's not a serious answer to your question, but it deals with the metaphor with which you started. On the question of how to resolve these issues, I'm not sure that I've fully got the tension that you're referring to, Salim. But it's possible that you're concerned with the view that the vocality often makes a big difference compared with incest. For example, one of my complaints have been that Africa gets very little hearing these days. G20 has very little representation of Africa. And I think the developing countries, other developing countries which are there, don't end up taking up the case for Africa. Because there was a time when India did try to do that, but it doesn't do anymore. Recently I've been chastising India, along with Thailand, of course China even more, about going along with the military dictatorship in Burma, because there was a vowel there, as you would put it, in the form of Aung San Suu Kyi, but of course she had been silenced by the confidence of the military rulers, if I may use your analogy there. So I think what we have to do is to see how the unrepresented interests get expression in these forums, in the global forums and elsewhere. That's a very big question, and it's a subject that will come up with global warming, dealing with issues of global justice, including medical care across the world, patent rights. The old patent rights may be changing. What would be its implications? All of these are issues of global justice, which needs global engagement. Neither the resignation that comes from the social contract approach, there is no global justice, it's a chimera, nor that it's too complicated. No issue is too complicated if it's within reasoning to discuss whether the changes proposed are good changes or bad changes, and what other changes we'd like to propose. I think it's that incremental dialogic view that Mahatma Patel was raising in a different context of human rights remains central, even in answer to your question. So thanks very much for asking that.
Thank you, sir. I believe it's on this side, and the lady in the black, and then we will switch over to the side.
Hello, Dr. Sen. It's a pleasure to come here and meet you. My name is Ashok Sadwani. I'm based in Los Angeles, and I come to Thailand once every year to teach a semester at Chula. I teach in Los Angeles International Business and Trade. In fact, I was born in Calcutta, and we are flying there tomorrow, and next week we've planned actually to go and spend one day in Shantiniketan, 1 day and 1 night. Even though I was born in Calcutta.
Tomorrow.
I'm flying tomorrow to Calcutta. We'll be going to Shantiniketan on Monday. So the
You're 1 day behind me. I'm going to Calcutta today. I'm going to Shantiniketan tomorrow. So I will be just 1 day ahead in each field.
If you're going to be staying overnight, we are at the Mark and Meadows. Maybe we can bump into each other.
No, I'm coming back. Well, my friend George Yeo, the foreign minister of Singapore, wanted to see Shantiniketan, Tagore, and I was also born there. He's a close friend, so I'm giving him a conducted tour of Shantiniketan.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sorry that I'm going to be one day later.
I'll keep the place warm for you.
Thank you. I'm sure you will. It will be a wonderful visit there because I've never ever been. Looking forward to it. My question concerns about, you said that there is no system of global justice because there are so many countries in the world and it's very hard for every country to coagulate their thoughts, and there are so many different kinds of justice. But my question relates to some kind of an index. Just like there is a transparency index perhaps, or corruption index in the world, if there is something like that, or if there isn't, perhaps are countries developing that, or could they develop a global justice index, and many countries then could draw from the different kinds of justice, like the social justice, religious justice, economic justice, and be able to do some research and come to some kind of dialogue between the different government departments within each country as well as within countries in the world as a whole. So your thoughts on some index in the future?
So my thoughts on this, first of all, let me clarify. I didn't say there is no justice, there are different countries, etc. My point was contrary. I'm glad you raised the question. That those who take a social contract approach, they would say it's a chimera. That is not my view. That's the view I'm rejecting. We may disagree on our ultimate view of society, and the perspectives that are coming from different countries may also differ, but we can still agree on many things. Like we could arrive at a reasonable global agreement on global warming, which didn't emerge in Copenhagen, because the whole idea of getting such an agreement with Europeans were very keen on, without first having had the extensive dialogue, how to address the issues, European priority on stopping all kinds of emissions as quickly as possible, the Chinese priority of allowing them to pollute a bit because the Europeans have done it for a very long time, and the Indians somewhere in that direction. and the Americans relatively confused as to what they want from the global warming, if anything, coming partly from the contrast between the executive and the legislative branches of the American government. All this notwithstanding, there could have been much more discussion about is there a reasonable agreement. Not perfect, the Chinese may not feel they got what they wanted, and the Europeans may think that they didn't get all they wanted, but is there an agreement on which they could have arrived at, which would have been better than no agreement at all, and which would have been a little better than what had just emerged in the recent meeting in the follow-up, which wasn't a great achievement. So I think searching for agreed ways of enhancing justice or reducing injustice still remains a major territory through dialogue, through discussion, and through interchange. Indexing, has ended up being seen as kind of author of this index and that. People who don't know anything at all about my work point out I did something about Human Development Index. And recently, because I worked with Joe Stiglitz and others on the Sarkozy appointed commission, I get quoted about all kinds of things, including a happiness index, on which I never spoke actually, but it gets attributed. Even the Prime Minister of Britain was very kind, made a kind remark to me while introducing the happiness index, but it wasn't my idea. And so, but let me just say that I'm really a little, one way of putting it would be a little fed up with indexes. The main reason is, what is it that an index doing? I think it's very important to look at the foundation of maths behind an index. Index is a real number that the first job of which is to rank. 76 is higher than 23, we know that. But 76 is higher than 23 in a way that's bigger than 23 is higher than 22. So you're moving from various degrees of measurement. Many of our difficulty of justice is not to get even the ranking. And the distances, and one of my PhD theses, I'm very proud, I had about 150 brilliant PhD students in my life. One of which, Kaushik Basu's thesis, was about how you can get to so-called cardinality from differences, comparability, difference of difference, comparability, difference of difference to different comparability, and so on. An index has all of them. That's too much to ask for, really. And I think we are getting into premature indexization of many things. The first thing to ask, what can we rank? If you get that, you already got some kind of purpose that an index is allowed to serve. If the index is not going to help any more than your basic thought about which is better, which is worse, which is what my book is concentrating on, is going to do. So am I in favor of index of justice? No, I'm not. Am I in favor of ranking of the just and unjust in each perspective? Yes, I am. But that's not the same thing as indexing. Indexing would have to have that ranking plus ranking of differences and, of course, Kaushik Basu, differences of differences and differences of differences of differences and so on. And that level of complexity is neither necessary nor achievable. So if I had caught you in some indication, I would have explained, but since I can't, I tell you now that I think don't get too much into the indexing. Think about the ranking.
Thank you. I was just only wanting the background about the index rather than the numbering part of it, the work that goes behind it. But if I have some time after...
it sometimes ends up giving folk... The reason I agreed to work for Sarkozy's request is because not so much that I wanted an index, and we didn't give them an index either. What we did do, the commission did, was to give various indicators that we can use, but our concentration was more on agreed ranking and how each of these indicators could be improved. That included the GDP, which we are often criticized, but if you're going to use GDP and we will continue to use it, we might as well do it better. So that's what the commission that Stiglitz and I and Joe and others were involved in tried to do.
Thank you for your insight.
And yes, we have the next question. We have quite a few more, and it looks like, by the time we finish the 4 questions, there will be time for the end session. Yes.
Thank you so much. I'm a student from Vienna and had a chance to study here in Bangkok.
Yeah, you have to come closer.
Oh, sorry. I'm not used to that. I'm a student from Vienna, from Austria.
From Austria, yeah.
And I got the chance to study at Thammasat for 1 semester. And my question is that, like what I experienced and saw in Thailand is that the families are playing a major role in society, and that they have a great connection and that they really care for each other. And so my question is, what you think, what role the families play in your inclusiveness approach and in your life center approach, and especially according to Thailand. Thank you.
Yeah, I have a book, not one that has come up in today's discussion, called Identity and Violence. And there I point out that each kind of identity, and being a member of a family is a serious identity, has its constructive side. It helps each other. Even the example from Sutta Nipata, where Buddha discusses mother's obligation to the child, and if it becomes dominant, there is a family-based idea behind it, clearly. And given that, family can play a constructive role. On the other hand, if you, in your job, if you prefer your nephew or your son rather than others who are more qualified, well, there is family playing a negative part. Similarly, nationalism could be a very big thing, which allows you to overcome differences of religion, community, communal violence, and so on. Not surprising that Gandhi and Nehru were quite keen on nationalism at the time of Hindu-Muslim riots. And yet, they were also very critical of nationalism when it comes to taking an approach about the global world, which is why they wanted to have non-allied nations treatment and indeed a different view of the United Nations and so on. So I think the family has very positive roles to play, but it also can play a very negative role like every other identity that we happen to have. That's one of the pieces of the book. And we have a choice. We are a member of a family, we are a member of a nation, we are a citizen of a country. We have a religion, we have a profession, we have a gender, we belong to a class, we speak a language, we like some kind of poetry. Each of these give us an identity. And depending on the context, we have to ask, what is the identity that is constructive and relevant here? Rather than follow saying, I am a Hindu, I am a Muslim, therefore it's my duty to kill the other. That's right. And religious extremism says that you have no choice, because that is your identity. If you are a Muslim, then you have to be an extremist Muslim, which is not what most Muslims are in the world. So that's the thing to look at. What are the constructive things? What are the non-constructive things? And recognize always there is a choice in deciding how do you want to see yourself in the context of any particular question that you're facing. My book called Identity and Violence, but the subtitle is The Illusion of Destiny. Our identity is not a destiny, it's a matter of choice, of reasoning. And by being rather in the line of what I was trying to emphasize earlier, the enlightened approach is to emphasize that. Enlightenment consists also of asking the question, what identity is relevant here? What identity would be for me best to pursue in this context? So thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Now we have following 4 questions. Beginning with lady in the front.
Thanks. My name is Niyada Jetyin Angsari from Social Research Institute, Chulalongkorn University. When we were preparing the project on how to alleviate the inequity in the society, we discussed a lot on terms and concepts, and we came up with so many terms. Justice, the essence of today, and then the fairness. So I would like to hear your thought on how these terms and how can we bring together the similarity or the differences and how we integrate together, that how can we work on to reduce the inequity in the society. Thank you.
Yeah. I think that's a very good question. Not because it admits of a very clear answer. It's a big question because that's a question you have to go on asking. How can we pursue it? And two things to say on that. Of course, the first thing to do in any of these contexts is to talk and chat and see what are the ways to do. So I think in any solution, the dialogic part has to be an important part of the solution. But there could be many other ways of interacting with each other. I don't think we should try to formulate or formalize what are the ways that can be brought about. It's a question, it is a matter of a commitment of keeping the question in front. And I still, as I was mentioning earlier, to ask the right question is halfway to the solution. It applies here too. Even that when the solution is not at all clear, by insisting on the question rather than giving up, you explore things. What would be the way of doing it? I took it, one of the reasons for the National Health Assembly to which I went yesterday, is to identify questions more sharply, connected with the basic question, how can we get together? And as Anand said at the beginning, inclusiveness is a very important central issue here. How do we pursue the inclusiveness? So I think that question itself has a value, even though it doesn't have an unambiguous answer in a formulaic term. When I was a young economist in Trinity College, I don't know whether Anand remembers one of my teachers, Theo Safra, and he's a great Italian economist. He told me that you have to be very careful that the Cambridge vices in economics, in constructing an economic theory, is not to rest until a theory has been converted into a slogan. And I'm very afraid of slogans. I have no slogan in answer to it. But there is a theory. Argue, pursue, see what the alternatives are. It won't be a fetchy slogan if you read into a slogan. But yours is the right question. Thank you.
Sawarak from TV Thai. As you know that on the May and April we have violence in Thailand. We have a riot. There's so many Thai people.
We have what?
Riot. Riot and violence.
Yeah.
Yes.
In China?
In Thailand.
Oh, in Thailand.
Yes.
Okay.
So most Thai people think it comes from the injustice in Thailand. As you say that it's a class war. And do you think the real justice can solve our problem in Thailand, and how?
You know what I have said on that. I mean, listen, you're Thai and I'm not. I've been here for 3 days now. I can tell you a lot about Thai food.
Okay.
But you don't rely on me to answer the question. But I have from time to time tried to address that question. I think it's a big mistake to think of it mainly as a class war. That is one aspect. There's a rich poor aspect, there's a rural urban aspect, there's a regional aspect. There's a complexity here. I think the last thing we want is a kind of reductionism that we got in analyzing that. And some of I complained about it in an earlier visit, I think it was in July, that for example, even journals like the New York Times seem to see it as nothing other than a class war, which vastly oversimplifies a complexity about rules following, the different groups involved, the different priorities, the leadership of each group, and the need for systematic change as well as orderly change, as opposed to a disorderly change. And I think all these require to address the issue in terms of all the divisions that come in. Now, I did try to say something not very profound. I ended up by saying these are very ordinary thoughts, but these were something which I presented yesterday at the Thai Health Assembly. And basically there are many aspects to it, and even though quite often I complain that the newspapers never seem to get the story right, when I looked this morning at the Nation and the Bangkok Post, what they claimed I said, I think roughly that is what I did say. It was very always surprises me, but that is the case. So these are my views there. And it seems to just think of it as a simply one-dimensional conflict would be a huge mistake, I believe. And I was upset when some of the finest media in the world, and there's no other paper in the world like the New York Times, when it does the mistake of such oversimplification, there is a problem involved.
Thank you. For the next two members of the audience, please keep your questions short because Dr. Sen has to...
She's also saying I should keep my answers short.
No, I did not say that. Questions. Because you do need to catch your flight to...
I have to catch the flight. Yes, I have to leave in 5 minutes, yes.
Right, so please go up.
So ask a question that admits of a simple answer like yes or no.
Okay, maybe this answer you have to explain a little bit long. My name is Kanika Jitiweshikun. You said and mentioned that inclusive public dialogue is so crucial to solve social injustice. But in some case, some issue, conducting inclusive public dialogue is not so easy. The one who long before has powerful voice, powerful power, might ignore to participate in any kind of this public dialogue that can raise the concern of marginalized voice, as we can see in the recent National Health Assembly. So what can this kind of public dialogue can go on to solve the injustice?
Well, I think that's a very important question, but that doesn't admit of a very quick answer, I think. But you're quite right to emphasize the exclusion of the marginalized as a central feature that has to be addressed, and the ways and means of doing it. So I think it's in the direction to which you're pointing is correct. But I'm not going to give a thesis on how to deal with that right now, but I hope you pursue that question. Thank you.
Yes, and we'll come to the last question.
Yes, my name is Varisa Chudipanya. I'm a new graduate from National Institute Development of Administration in Thailand. My question is similar to the former question, but I would like to ask you in as economist point of view, and as you know that Thailand have problems about different thinking and that leads to many problems as previous said. But some people say that the gap between the rich and the poor is the part of the problem. So I would like to ask you some questions about I would like to ask you to suggest us the ways how to solve the problem in the economic way.
Yeah, the economic way is a very important way to think about people, there's no question. And rich and poor is a very big division. It's a very big division of class and income levels. But that's not the only division. So that is the point I was trying to make yesterday, that at one level you have to emphasize the importance of it. At another level, it's a little like the answer to the question that I gave to Salil Sen in answer to the identity issue, that you have to see that there are other divisions that come in. Regionality is a big issue. Urban rural is a big divide. There are all kinds of ways that it come in. Professions which are more complicated than just class and income level. It could be very big. Some professions have articulation, others don't. Education is a big division. So I think one has to look at the variety of ways in which these divisions come about. And rich and poor, that division will fit into it. But the temptation to capture the world in terms of just that one division is a mistake. Let me give you an example in terms of one of the great political leaders leading thinkers of the world, namely Karl Marx. If you look at something like the Communist Manifesto, 1848, you get a picture which is highly simple. Why? It's not an analysis, it is a manifesto, as the name says. So at that time, for the political party that Marx was trying to inspire, he thought that that's the thing that's most neglected, which you ought to emphasize. Was it his view that that's the only thing that matters? If you look at another document, indeed his last published book, Critique of Gotha Program, 1875, she says that it's a huge mistake to think that human beings can be identified by class only. The idea that you see a worker only as a worker, everything else is forgotten about him or her, is a huge mistake, because there are so many dimensions of humanity. Similarly, in another analysis, a deep social analysis called 18 Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, which comes in between these two documents, he's discussing there how many classes there are. There are like 150 of them, connected with profession, income, location, etc. So I think anyone who's aiming at some level of sophisticated understanding, even as actively politically engaged as Marx, has to move away from a simple one basis classification, which is called class war, which is the way the earlier riots, and even some of the earlier BBC broadcasts I heard, were describing it, which seemed to me, since I know high society a certain amount, seemed not the only thing that divides people in this country. And I couldn't believe that it could be just that we are seeing, and indeed on the basis of what I came to read a bit more about it, turns out to be the case. So I think it's the multiplicity of divisional forces that's very important to emphasize, and economics and class will fit into it, and income level would have a role in it, but not usurp the role that other parameters, other dimensions have to be given in order to get a fuller picture of what's going on. So thank you very much. I think she will cut me off if I want to answer any more.
I was thinking about that. Thank you very much, Professor Sen, and thank you for all the questions. If you have any further questions and have a chance to ask them, please write them in, the notepad and leave them at the registration desk, and we will be sure to send them to Sanjay Niketan for Professor Sen for his answers later. Right now I would like to call upon Dr. Vichai Chowiwat, the Chairman of the Executive Board, National Health Commission, to express his appreciation for Dr. Sen for coming to talk with us today.
Professor Sen, Kudalan Pajalachun, our beloved former Prime Minister, Mr. Mongkol Songkhla, our brave Health Minister, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming today to today's lecture. During the past hour or so, we have listened to a discussion of the idea of justice and recommendations for action from the speaker, as well as the question and answer session. I personally support Professor Sen's position, as in his book and lecture, the idea of justice from idea to action. This justice cannot be realized in an undemocratic society. I would like to emphasize that Professor Sen was referring to democracy in its true essence, not by way of political institutions, elections, or the will of the majority. This is about acknowledging and listening to every voice, especially those of the minority, and engaging all in a dialogue. According to Professor Sen, democracy involves people interactions. He believes that if people are constructively engaged, they will learn from the perspectives and values of others which may different from their own. Well-organized and balanced interaction can lead to mutual recognition, reconciliation, and harmony. We need not be in complete agreement because diversity of thought reflects diversity of value systems. As Dr. Mongkol has said, despite our difference, we are all Thais and all humans. With our commonality, together we can move beyond the current crisis rather than destroying one another. On this note, I would like to express my deep appreciation of Professor Sen, who has found the time, despite his busy schedule, to come to Bangkok and to enlighten us with his lecture. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Sen is now 77, but still very active. He is still traveling by himself with his 2 computers that facilitate him to work anywhere and anytime. When we call Professor Amartya Sen, we are misled by his name in Thai. Amartya in Thai leads us to think about an elite or a very high-ranking official, which is not correct. In fact, he was named by Rabindranath Tagore, the first Asian who had got the Nobel Prize in literature. His name means Amata, or immortal. So I believe his enriching thought will remain in this world forever. Thank you again, once again, for taking part in this morning most enriching session. Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming and have a safe trip home.